Hello everyone, welcome to the 10th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the 4th week of this 30-hour course on Sociology of Development spanning over 12 weeks, and this is the last lecture of the 4th week, Modernization Theory Part 1. And in Modernization Theory, if you slightly recall, as we have discussed, the modernization theory postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. I mean, that is how the first sociological account of development emerged in the form of modernization theory, and it is the mainstream school of scholarship about poverty and economic, social and political development in the countries of the third world. The adherents of this approach do not actually see themselves as a cohesive school. They are more inclined to emphasize their disputes among them and to dismiss the dependency school and the Marxists as irrelevant or excessively doctrinal or political. We have discussed this, and in the last two classes what we have discussed, it is an important idea in this school. An important idea in this school is the concept of the traditional society, and the proponents of modernization theory think of today's third world societies as being largely traditional. They also think of Western Europe as having been traditional in the long period before the era of modern economic growth and cultural change in the form of industrial revolution, rise of critical thinking, rationality, reasoning capacity, and the decline of the dominance of church in the social and public life. The essence of a traditional society is that it is stagnant and unchanging. Its values are spiritual, not grounded in individual self-betterment. Its rhythms of life are circular, not linear and progressive. One always returns to the same place. The traditional world is emotionally comfortable, a world in which each person has a place that is secure, a place in the family among the pantheon of ancestors. And the traditional person identifies with her or his ancestors and emulates them. And daily work is carried out just as it always has been, not to secure a profit, but to perform one's duty to maintain one's place in the society. Nothing is innovative and there is no attempt to better one's lot. No distinction exists between daily life and spiritual life, that is all one, and almost any religious system can serve as the basis for a traditional society. And as you know, modernization theory was based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism. Structural functionalism is based on the fact that society is composed on the basis of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. And as you know, theories of modernization, however, are explicitly or implicitly premised, explicitly or implicitly are theories of capitalist development, which are premised upon the creation and maintenance of the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society. It is as modernization theory is based largely on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism. Modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity, to be brought about at the economic level, at the social level and at the political level. That is what we have discussed. And how we have also discussed in the last two classes how modernization theory has accorded central role to the state and public policy, but it failed to examine the nature of the state itself, its location within the matrix of a class divided society, and its relationship with contending social forces. And thereby the state is thought of as an entity that stands outside and above society, and the state is also thought of as an autonomous agency that is invested potentially from independent source of with an independent source of rationality, enriched by technical assistance from developed countries. And the state is also thought of having the capability to initiate and pursue programs of development for the benefit of the whole of society. And in this sense, there is an implicit disjunction between the state and society, slurring over questions about the social foundations of political power and the making of public policy. The problematic of the state is then narrowed down to that of the efficacy of its public institutions and organs to achieve objectives and programs of modernization, focusing especially on the respective roles of ruling elites, dominant political parties, the bureaucracy and the military. And then we have discussed how there are different issues involved in the relationship between the state and society in modernization theory. I mean, instrumental nature of the state, there are different organs of the state, there are different representatives of the state. Are they in fact servants of the state or the masters to rule the common people? And we have also discussed functionalist theory, political sociology and sociology of development. And as we have discussed, theories of modernization are essentially theories of capitalist development, which are premised upon the creation and maintenance of the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society, which may be contrasted with the notions of revolutionary change, that is a decisive break with the internal structures and the encompassing international framework of global capitalism, notions of exploitation, oppression, domination and subordination and antagonism of class interests. Okay, that is how we have discussed how on the one hand we witness modernization theory or the theory of capitalist development, and on the other we witness the theory of socialist development. There is a similarity between both types of change. The similarity lies in the dissolution and transformation of pre-capitalist social and economic structures, but the difference lies in terms of their methods. And then we have discussed structures, when I say social and economic structures, political, in terms of the political system, in terms of the state and so on. And there is an alternative view, the one that does not reify as a whole as functionalist theory does, but proceeds instead from the idea of the social process being constituted by interactions of free acting individuals. The market model nevertheless arrives at very similar conclusions to those of functionalist theory on issues of relevance. And then we have discussed what is reification, that refers to the process where the result of our actions appears to us as a quasi-natural thing or matter or object, because we do not recognize its social origins or process of creation that goes into its formation. And then we have discussed economic markets, I mean free competition, foreign investment, structural imperatives and so on, and political markets, I mean political entrepreneurs aiming to maximize votes, legislation, the application of laws and authoritative allocations of value. And when I say structural imperative, I mean this is the imperative of capitalism, capitalist mode of production. Its imperative character lies in the fact that it determines the consequences of all such actions. It makes the new institutions successively the basis on which fresh calculations are made and corrective action contemplated. And the aim of structural imperative is to recognize the possibility of disjunction within limits and at particular moments between the making of public policy and the contending interests of the dominant classes, the indigenous bourgeois, the metropolitan bourgeois and landowning classes, as well as the fact that such deviations not only have limits, but cannot persist over a long period of time. For they are soon overtaken by the consequences of such policies, which bring into play forces for an alteration of the course, so that state policies are brought into line with the requirements and demands of peripheral capitalism, I mean capitalism in the less developed countries. And this view of the economic determination in the last instance allows us to account for the stupidity and miscalculations of the guardians of the state and for the degree of freedom that possess in possibly pursuing their own interests by virtue of being in charge of the state apparatus. And the question of the plurality of dominant classes in peripheral capitalist societies, which is unlike that in advanced capitalist countries where we have only one dominant class to contend with, a fact that has shaped Marxist debates on the theory of the state in particular mold, one that does not easily fit the case of the peripheral capitalist societies. And the problem of identifying the ruling classes and class alignments in peripheral capitalist societies is more complex than in advanced capitalist countries. Thereby, we have discussed fundamental classes, I mean the class of exploited producers and the exploiting class, whose social relations of production are constitutive of that mode of production. And we have also discussed class formation, class alignments. We have discussed fractions of a single class analogous to the division of the bourgeois in advanced capitalist countries into different fractions such as industrial capital, finance capital and commercial capital. And we have also discussed auxiliary classes, political role of the educated salaried middle classes in peripheral capitalist societies and class origins of the bureaucracy. And today what we are going to do in this lecture, we are going to discuss modernization theory in terms of, modernization theory as an important dimension within development studies and reaction to modernization theory in Latin America and South Asia, distinction between traditional and modern societies, which was derived from Max Weber via Talcott Parsons, and as modernization as the process of transition from traditional to modern principles of social organization, and this process currently occurring in Asia, Africa and Latin America. We will also discuss traditional modern distinction, dichotomy and political development, and then we will have a case in point Huntington's political order in changing societies as social science theory, evidence scientism as ideology, Huntington's The Class of Civilizations, which he wrote maybe 20 years back or so. Then we are going to start with conceptual fragmentation and conflict that has overtaken development studies. Okay. In the when we start with this, you will find that in the conceptual fragmentation and conflict that has overtaken development studies, the leading place often seems to be held by the dependency theory, dependency theorists or underdevelopment theorists. We will discuss dependency theorists particularly in the seventh, in the 8th lecture, 8th and 9th lecture, 8th, 9th and 10th week of this course. Why I'm depending on dependency right now precisely because of the kind of reaction to modernization theory in Latin American societies. Okay? Because the dependency theory emerged in the context of the Latin American discussion of development, of underdevelopment. Okay? That we are going to deal with in the 8th, 9th and 10th week of the course. And this dependency school first became widely known in the West towards the end of the 1960s, particularly through the polemical attack led by Andre Gunder Frank when he wrote Capitalism and Underdevelopment of Latin America in 1969. And he wrote that as a polemical attack on US dominated modernization theory. And since then, the proponents of dependency theory have been severely criticized in their turn by Marxists, but there would appear to have been no serious reply from the orthodox right. This appearance is deceptive. However, especially in the United States and perhaps above all among political scientists in the United States I mean US sphere of influence, which is still a considerable one. It is true that the ideologists of developmentalism had no answers to the devastating critique of Andre Gunder Frank and others. However, their paradigm enforcing powers were immense. For a long time, the dependency theorists' attack was simply ignored. Instead of scientific debate, there was a retreat from confrontation with anti-imperialist theory. While efforts were made to consolidate a major transformation in imperialist development theory that was already underway when the onslaught by Frank and others occurred. This was a shift to a concern with the maintenance of order. The revolution in Cuba, followed by the accumulating humiliation of US policy in Vietnam, and the revolutionary instability and increasing reaction to modernization theory in Latin America and South Asia, that undermined the original optimistic assumptions of orthodox development theory, that is modernization theory, that the process of development involved drawing the populations of the third world out of their traditional isolation into a modern social system that would be participative, pluralistic and democratic. A growing number of American social scientists began to recognize that this was not in fact the destiny of third world countries developing in the framework of US imperialism or leadership. Increasingly, their thinking turned from a concern with the processes of modernization, the processes of transformation into advanced capitalist and hence pluralistic and democratic societies, to a concern with the maintenance of social control. Now, what structural functionalists, modernization theorists, they spoke about, they dwelt upon order, how to maintain social order. I mean by creating and maintaining the basic structures and institutions of a capitalist society. Now, this order has in fact turned out to be control. How are you going to control the various mechanisms of bureaucracy, various mechanisms of the state, legislature, and unfortunately now judiciary is also controlled by the state, which is the most important political institution. Yet a complete break with the theoretical apparatus inherited from the optimistic phase of development ideology was neither practicable nor desirable. The need was to transform that apparatus, and when I say transform that apparatus, I mean whose central animating concept was modernization, in such a way as to incorporate the new concern with maintaining order and wherever possible at the same time co-opt the more persuasive themes of dependency theory and even Marxism itself. How this task has been carried out in various branches of theory lies beyond the scope and ambit of this lecture, but what is attempted, what I am going to do here is to bring out the general nature of the ideological reconstruction involved by examining the work of for example Samuel Huntington, who wrote Political Order in Changing Societies, who also wrote The Class of Civilizations and so on, and he led the way in initiating this reconstruction. But before getting into this, it is important to understand the concept of modernization through the distinction between traditional and modern societies, which was derived from Max Weber through or via Talcott Parsons and especially Parsonian pattern variables. Okay? A society was called traditional in which most relationships were particularistic rather than universalistic, such as based on ties to particular people, such as kin rather than general criteria designing whole classes of persons. In secondly, I mean one is, if you look at one is particularism versus universalism. One is ascription versus achievement. Ascription means which is based on birth, and achievement which is not based on birth, what you get through your performance. And that is why secondly, in which birth ascribed qualities rather than achieved qualities was the central ground for holding a job or an office, in which feelings rather than objectivity governed relationships of all sorts. Affectivity versus affective neutrality. Okay. And in which roles were not clearly separated. For instance, the royal household was also the state apparatus. Diffuseness versus specificity. Okay. These are the pattern variables, that is why Parsonian pattern variables. Particularism versus universalism, ascription versus achievement, affectivity versus affective neutrality, and diffuseness versus specificity. A society in which the opposite of all these was true was modern. Other features generally seen as characteristic of traditional societies included things like a low level of division of labor, dependence on agriculture, low rates of growth of production, largely local networks of change, and restricted administrative competence. Again, modern societies displayed the opposite features, in the sense that high level of division of labor, low dependence on agriculture, high rates of growth of production, largely global networks of exchange, and unrestricted administrative competence. And modernization in this sense referred to the process of transition from traditional to modern principles of social organization, and this process was what was currently occurring in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Okay. From today's vantage point, from the vantage point of the 21st century, it is easy to see that the traditional modern distinction was at bottom simply a pair of very arbitrary abstractions from the contemporary situations of the periphery and the center respectively. Situations of the periphery and the center of the world capitalist system, and that the concept of modernization was no more than a proposal to consider the traditional society as a once universal original state, and the modern society as a universal end state, with the so called modernization process serving as quite fictitious surrogate for the historical processes that have actually taken place or are taking place at both the periphery as well as the center. However, those political scientists, social scientists who were unaware of the ideological nature of those formulations saw in them the basis for an attempt to conceptualize political development. It is an element as one element of the modernization syndrome, that is the modernization process itself at the level of politics. This gave rise to a multiplicity of proposals. Political development, it was suggested, involved democratization, political mobilization, the building of nation states, administrative and legal development, secularization of equality, subsystem, autonomy, and so on. And according to Huntington himself, the starting point for his own theorizing was a rejection of the concept of political development, because it indeed had no clear meaning. In its place, he proposed to discuss merely political change. Okay? That is what political development for Huntington. Okay? Instead of political development, he emphasized on political change. Okay? If this had been true, it would have implied at least an attempt to break with modernization theory, but it was not true. In his main book, Political Order in Changing Societies, published in 1968, okay, you will find that a central place is occupied by the concept of political decay. Okay, political development to political change to political decay. A condition signalized by unrest, violence, corruption and coups, and the one which retains all the normative and teleological content of the concept of political development, only expressed as its opposite. And this continuity, this preservation of the essential concepts of modernization theory, but in forms adapted to the new concern with order, is a fundamentally significant aspect of Huntington's thought. However, we are going to discuss three aspects that Huntington did make a major break. Then what are these three? First, he really did switch attention to a kind of political change in terms of revolution. Okay, which was the central issue of contemporary third world politics. The concepts with which we generally try to analyze third world politics were thinly disguised abstractions from the political, from the pluralistic interpretation of American politics, according to which politics consists of incremental adjustments to the evolving balance between competing interests mediated by competing electoral machines which aggregate the interests of groups drawn from all strata of society. And in Huntington's conception of politics, in contrast, the central place was given to potentially revolutionary struggles for state power by radically disconnected social forces, I mean workers, students, urban middle classes, peasants. They all will be pushed to the margins. I mean, the state will not listen to peasants, students, teachers, urban middle classes, the downtrodden, marginalized communities. Okay? That is what Huntington argues. Huntington's view of third world politics seemed above all realistic in nature, and the second is that Huntington's work seemed genuinely theoretical. Okay? It was very difficult to extract from the previous literature on political development anything that really proposed explanations of large scale important political phenomena. There were more or less elaborate classificatory systems or typologies, but very little usable theory. Huntington, by contrast, offered to explain, among other things, why pressures for change assumed a reformist or revolutionary character. That change that we discuss, this is one. Secondly, that change may be reformist or revolutionary in character. Okay? Why reforms or revolutions succeeded or failed, and why, in the absence of either reform or revolution, third world countries tended to pass under personal, arbitrary and authoritarian rule. Okay? And India is no exception to this today. And these two changes, okay, have a lot to do with the academic and practical influence of Huntington's work. attention has been diverted from them, however, by the third departure that Huntington made from previous orthodoxy, his open and abrasive commitment to the maintenance of order at the supreme political value. Order at the supreme political value. Okay. This is perhaps a little problematic, and then Huntington's views on this issue were not very different from those of numerous other leading American social scientists, political scientists of the later 1960s, but they were more stringently and unambiguously expressed. Throughout Huntington's work, there runs a strong current of dislike for the confusing, disturbing and contradictory aspirations of the masses, and an admiration for any elite bureaucracy or leadership capable of containing, channeling and if necessary suppressing them. Okay. Huntington's obsession with authority as constitutive of political value. This is problematic. Okay. For the movement, nevertheless, the important point is that it was in spite of this, as much as because of it, that Huntington's work achieved the influence it did, refreshing as it might be to many members of the beleaguered American professorate in 1968. The open fear of and disaster for the masses that Huntington expressed was hardly a viable posture for most of them. Why I am referring to 1968 precisely because in the next class I am going to start with 1968 famous student strikes in France, and you will find that the great upsurge in France by students was also joined by scholars like Anthony Giddens and so on. Giddens later on became the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science and so on. Huntington's argument suggests that conventional wisdom among both social scientists and policy makers in the United States, Huntington noted which held that the poorer people are, the more prone they will be used to the poorer people are, the more prone they will be to use violence to remedy their situation, the more unstable politics will be. Accordingly, you will find in most of the third world countries, including India, at least in theory, it has been directed toward securing economic growth in the belief that this is coupled with reforms made possible by growing output would lead towards political stability. Okay. That people talk about technology, people talk about computers, people talk about Atmanirbhar, people talk about Arogya Setu, many things are there, right? But everything is there just to have control over the masses and so on. And statistical evidence shows that there is more stability in countries with the lowest per capita incomes than in countries somewhat less poor. And Huntington's interpretation of this is that as modernization defined as social mobilization plus economic development occurs, more and more people become politically active or become active in ways that impinge more and more on the central government, political participation, because increased social mobility leads to raised expectations which at an early stage of economic growth cannot be met, and economic growth also leads at first to heightened inequality which also prompts greater political participation. Unless political institutions are capable of handling this expanded participation, it will assume destabilizing forms, demonstrations, strikes, riots or even armed struggles, and or lead to corruption equally liable to give rise to instability in the long run. What determines whether the increased level of participation produces these destabilizing consequences or not is the degree of institutionalization of the polity. Strongly institutionalized polities socialize, that is formally and informally induct the newly participant citizens into the channels and norms of political action that are prescribed by the existing structures. This leads to civic politics. Civic politics may or may not take a democratic form. Constitutional democracies and communist dictatorships are both participant polities. Participation, in other words, need not mean popular control of government, but rather governmental control of the people through their involvement in the organs of the polity that make this possible. Weak institutionalized polities on the contrary are easily overwhelmed by new groups which enter politics, participate on their own terms, giving rise to in which the wealthy bribe students, riot, workers strike, mobs demonstrate, and the military coup. Then this is how Huntington argues that revolutions are not primarily about economic issues. For Huntington, a revolution is a rapid, fundamental and violent domestic change in the dominant values and myths of a society, in its political institutions, social structure, leadership and government activity and policies. Now, if this is the important question about any reform for Huntington is not its merits per se, but simply whether it averts revolution or acts as a catalyst for it. That is how he talked about the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, that was based on the idea that reforms would avert revolution, and in particular reforms that respond to the demands of the urban intelligentsia make revolution more likely, because the intelligentsia are revolutionary from psychological insecurity, personal alienation and guilt, and an overriding need for a secure sense of identity. Okay? That is how Huntington, this is what Huntington argued. Then a critique to grasp the significance of Huntington's work, we have to analyze it on two levels. First, from the standpoint of the bourgeois social sciences, okay, and second, from that of historical materialism. Okay? That we have discussed earlier. Historical entails. What is historical in historical materialism? Now, the term historical entails how particular forms of society have come into existence. Okay? Suppose Marx is historical materialism. Societies have traversed through different stages, namely hunting and gathering economy, the slave society, the feudal society, the capitalist society, and which will inevitably and unstoppably move on to socialism and thereafter communism. Okay? That is what one is one from the standpoint of bourgeois social science, and second from that of historical materialism. That is why Huntington's political order in changing societies is extremely important as social science theory. In fact, on closer introspection, it proves to be vague. Huntington's reflections prove to be vague, tautologous, circular and confused. Its two central concepts, Huntington's two central concepts, participation and institutionalization, okay, were nowhere adequately defined. Participation included apparently any kind of conscious relationship whatever with the polity, no matter how ritualistic or empty, since, as we have seen, Huntington declared that today's Russians have a high degree of popular participation in political affairs when Soviet Union was there. Conversely, institutionalization was defined as the process by which organizations and procedures acquire value and stability, but this process was nowhere specified either. Instead, Huntington put forward 4 measures or tests of the level of institutionalization of any political system. 1. The adaptability, complexity, autonomy and coherence of its organizations and procedures. Adaptability could be measured by the age of an organization or procedure, that is the probability that an organization which is 100 years old will survive an additional year is perhaps 100 times greater than the probability that an organization 1 year old will survive 1 additional year. A movement's thought shows that this is absurd. Presumably recognizing this, Huntington added that another measure is the ability of an organization or procedure to survive challenges to its existence. The third measure of adaptability is the ability of an institution or organization or procedure is to abandon challenged functions and replace them with others and so survive. Okay. I mean these are but this reasoning too is circular. The evidence that an institution is adaptable is that it changes functions and survives. The evidence that it is not that it fails to change functions comes to an end. The other measures, the fourth one that Huntington provides, that institutionalization, complexity, autonomy and coherence, they suffer from exactly the same difficulty. Thus, the measure of autonomy is whether social forces outside the political system succeed in forcing themselves into it or not. The measure of coherence is whether the institutions of the polity rest on a consensus sufficiently strong to preserve them and so on. In short, the argument that Huntington made that political change is a product of the relation between participation and institutionalization turns out to be spurious, because institutionalization is defined in terms of the response of institutions to participation, whatever that implies. Okay? Then one is a social science theory. Okay? Then evidence is that part of the reason for the failure to push home the criticism of Huntington's work as unscientific may well have been the massive quantity of facts deployed in it. Dazzlingly comprehensive, his empirical knowledge seems encyclopedic, but most readers like these, Lilly and others who have mentioned that Huntington spared no effort to achieve one. The range of cases referred to and the number of sources cited were indeed impressive, even for a writer amply endowed with research assistance. But it is obviously not the quantity, but the quality of the factual evidence and the use made of it that matters. Okay? The careful reader soon realizes that the great flood of information with which she or he is being presented cannot be taken on trust. Okay? The central argument that stability is due to a high ratio of institutionalization of political participation is supported by citing evidence from a study that compared 26 countries with a low rate of want formation to want satisfaction, and hence low systemic frustration, and 36 countries with a high ratio and hence high systemic frustration. Okay? That is what Huntington did, and in the context of cross national statistical comparisons, which was favored by behavioral school to which modernization theorists in general belong. Okay? That is why you will find that we are trying to bring about a critique of Huntington's work. And when you come to scientism, of course, many other well regarded works on politics may be faulted for poor evidential support. What makes this criticism more than usually pertinent is that Huntington's use of evidence so often takes a scientific form. This is particularly true of the sections of political order in which political order in changing societies, we are discussing now scientism, in which the main steps of the argument are put forward. The main form of scientism is pseudo quantification. The text abounds with propositions about about the levels of middle class participation, the rate of increase of social frustration, the degree of corruption and so on, and this way of writing encourages acceptance of an argument by suggesting that appropriate quantitative data have been collected that verify the general statements made. Okay. And then we have what we are trying to do from the standpoint of bourgeois social sciences and so on. And when we come to bring about a critique of Huntington's political order in changing societies, Huntington's from the vantage point of historical materialism, then we are trying to look at Huntington's work as ideology. The problem that remains to be considered is why Huntington's work, with so many serious, not to say fatal, deficiencies of logic, methodology and factual support, should have become as influential as it did. The essence of the matter is Huntington revitalized the ideology of modernization, that is, that partially adequate but systematically mystified view of the ex-colonial world that formed the basis for imperialistic strategic action in a highly significant way. First, Huntington broke the connection that modernization had previously had with US pluralism. Second, he appropriated some of the central tenets of Marxism, which simultaneously appearing to invert Marx's tenets. The break with pluralism was more than the mere abandonment of the democratic ideal implicit in earlier modernization writing. For Huntington, third world societies do not consist of groups competing in fluctuating and shifting combinations for influence over the outputs of government, nor do modern systems differ from pre-modern or modernizing systems in this respect. In all political systems, the key is domination. Or as Huntington says, it is power. Okay? Power is something which has to be mobilized, developed and organized. It must be created. Huntington therefore wastes no time looking for the functional equivalents in the third world of interest articulation and interest aggregation, for example, as earlier modernization theorists did. For him, the central reality everywhere is the building of regimes capable of imposing their will on society. Okay? That lies the major problem. Huntington could see his conception of politics was much better adapted than the pluralist model to the conflictual realities of the third world, from General Jesus's Brazil to Indian context to Cuban context. Okay? You will also find that it is equally important to emphasize that defeating the revolution in Vietnam did not for Huntington necessarily entail defeating the Viet Cong. Okay? Huntington carried his anti-revolutionary outlook to its logical conclusion by separating it from anti-communism. For him, it was the ideal of fundamental reconstruction of society that was pernicious because utopian and destructive order. He did not see, this practical insight that it was not communism, not even as embodied in the Viet Cong, that was the real enemy, but revolution to which the bureaucratized communist parties were equally opposed, was what Huntington's book developed ideologically by a double process. First, Marxism, the theory and practice of the emancipation of labor, was treated dismissively as a partial theory. Marx focused on only one minor aspect of which more general phenomenon, and as politically naive Lenin was not a disciple of Marx, rather Marx was a precursor of Lenin. That is what Huntington argued in an erroneous manner. Okay? And if you look at the way Huntington tried to revitalize the ideology of modernization in several ways than once. He offered a crude but substantive phenomenology of classes, groups, power struggles, revolutions, corruption, militarism and the like, and important parts of which seem to be taken over from simultaneously discredited Marxism, and all of which could be in the form given by Huntington, integrated into the ahistorical and protean schema of tradition modernity, the dichotomy between tradition and modernity. As scientific theory, it was false. As propaganda, it was crude, though not necessarily ineffective, especially within the closely patrolled intellectual confines of most American political science departments. But as a model of ideological reconstruction, it was path-breaking. Dramatic example of the ideological flexibility of which bourgeois thought is capable, and one which was to have a profound influence on bourgeois thinking about development in the 1970s and in the 1980s. Then what we have discussed today, we have discussed the central fragmentation and conflict that has taken over development studies, and I mean in the context of the reaction to modernization theory in Latin America and South Asia, and the distinction between traditional and modern societies that we have taken from Weber via Talcott Parsons in terms of Parsonian pattern variables. I mean, when I say distinction between traditional and modern societies, I mean there lies a dichotomy within the purview of modernization theory, within the purview of the theory of capitalist development. And the way modernization refers to the process of transition from traditional to modern principles of social organization, and in this process currently occurring in Asia, Africa and Latin American continents. And then we have discussed traditional modern dichotomy or distinction as constituting a pair of arbitrary arbitrary abstractions from the contemporary situations of the periphery and the center respectively of the world capitalist system. We are going to discuss world capitalist system towards the end of the course, when we will deal with Immanuel Wallerstein, okay, when he talked about world system theory. And then political development, an element of the modernization syndrome, democratization, political mobilization, the building of nation states, administrative and legal development, secularization of equality, subsystem autonomy and so on. And then we have discussed Huntington's political order in changing societies, which he wrote in 1968. I mean this critique of Huntington we have discussed from two perspectives, from two vantage points, one from the vantage point of the bourgeois social sciences and the other from that of historical materialism, a social science theory, evidence, scientism as well as an ideology. Okay? And in the next class, what we are going to do, we are going to move on to the second phase of modernization theory in terms of class, state and revolution, substitutes and realities by Theodor Sanin. I mean in terms of empirical peasantry and hypothetical proletariat and so on. Thank you.